What if everything you've been told about female desire was wrong? Not just slightly off, but dangerously, profoundly inverted. This isn't about being edgy or controversial for its own sake. It's about diving into the repressed truth Freud stumbled upon and nearly lost his career over. The truth that modern psychology, pop culture, and polite society continue to suppress that female desire is not sweet, soft, or passive. It's chaotic. It's dark. It's wired for power, for imbalance, and emotional danger. Let's go back to 1895. A woman named Anna von Lieben stepped into Freud's office, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a mirror of every unspoken urge repressed by polite society. Wealthy, respected, and outwardly elegant, Anna was plagued by what doctors at the time labeled hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for anything women did that didn't fit into their prescribed feminine role. But Freud wasn't interested in labels. He was interested in what happened when you pulled back the curtain. As he peeled back the layers of her mind through his early experiments with talk therapy and dream interpretation, he found something terrifying, not because it was monstrous, but because it was honest. Anna fantasized about humiliation, domination, and being overpowered. These weren't anomalies. They were recurring, emotionally charged, and completely at odds with how she acted in public. Freud didn't judge her. He documented her. And in one of his private letters, he confessed, "The civilized woman is a facade. Underneath, the wildness lives unchecked by logic or morality." That wasn't poetry. That was his clinical observation. But here's where things started to spiral. Because Anna was just the beginning. A few years later, Freud treated a girl named Dora, just 18 years old, who accused a family friend of making inappropriate advances. On the surface, you'd expect Freud to diagnose trauma. But he noticed something strange. Dora wasn't broken by the man's advances. She was confused, internally conflicted. Her body responded with arousal, even as her mind recoiled. Freud didn't take this lightly. He coined the term, the eroticization of refusal. The idea that when a woman is denied, ignored, or challenged, it doesn't always result in resentment. Sometimes, it triggers an obsession. Desire, he claimed, isn't born from fulfillment. It's born from friction. Now let's pause here. Think about the modern man's dilemma. He's been taught, often with good intentions, that respecting boundaries, being sensitive, and asking for permission are the keys to a woman's heart. And in many cases, that's true on paper. But paper doesn't lie. Biology does. And biology doesn't always agree with morality. That's where Freud's work becomes radioactive. See, across human history, desire has never been a peaceful force. From Cleopatra to Helen of Troy, the women who moved empires weren't praised for their passivity. They were desired because they were difficult, mysterious, and emotionally dangerous. They sparked pursuit, not because they were attainable, but because they weren't. Freud believed this wasn't accidental. It was archetypal. Fast forward to today, and you see the same pattern. The romantic tension in books and movies, the teasing games in dating culture, and the rise of rough dominance in mainstream fantasy all point back to the same origin. Arousal isn't about safety. It's about imbalance, about power. And this leads us into one of Freud's most misunderstood theories, penis envy. Modern readers often scoff at it, thinking Freud was obsessed with anatomy. But that completely misses the point. Penis envy wasn't about genitalia. It was about agency. Freud argued that women, living in a male-dominated world, developed a psychological hunger for power, not despite being women, but because of it. Society taught them to receive, to yield, to be chosen. But deep down, the psyche rebels. It wants access to the thing it's denied. Not just physically, but psychologically. That hunger creates a paradox. On one hand, women may publicly celebrate equality, empowerment, and independence, and rightly so. But in the private world of fantasy, another story unfolds. One filled with dominance, submission, and asymmetrical desire. It's not hypocrisy. It's the divided self that Freud spent his life trying to understand. Which brings us to Alfred Kinsey, the man often called the father of sexology. In 1953, he did something few dared. He measured female arousal. What he found was disturbing, not because it exposed something wrong, but because it revealed something true. Women didn't respond the most to romantic, gentle, or predictable stories. They responded strongest to scenarios involving forced seduction, what today would be labeled problematic at best and deeply offensive at worst. Kinsey buried the data. He knew it contradicted the feminist wave that was gaining momentum. He understood the fallout of admitting that female desire might not align with female ethics. So, the results went unpublished, and a generation of men grew up believing that being nice was enough, that if you were respectful and safe, you'd win her over. But desire doesn't follow etiquette, and Freud knew it. Let's talk about another Freud patient, Edward, a young lawyer from 1908. Polite, kind, financially stable. The kind of man you'd bring home to your parents. And yet, he was miserable. His wife mocked him, cheated on him. Eventually, she left him for a man with no job, a criminal record, and nothing to offer but raw masculine chaos. Freud diagnosed Edward with what he called moral castration. The man had suppressed his power so completely that he became invisible. And if you think that's just a story from a different time, consider this. Today's men are more celibate than ever. According to multiple studies, men under 30 are 3 times more likely to be involuntarily single than they were just a generation ago. Why? Not because they've become less attractive, but because they've become more obedient. They followed the rules. They became safe. And women noticed. In 2018, a study conducted by the University of Oslo using dating apps showed something shocking. Women rated 85% of men as below average. Think about that. It wasn't just that they weren't interested. It was that they actively disqualified nearly every man who wasn't in the top tier of dominance, confidence, or unpredictability. Even worse, the data showed women would rather share an exciting man than commit to a loyal one they didn't feel intense attraction for. This is what Freud meant by the boredom principle. That desire dies in comfort. That satisfaction is not as erotic as suspense. And this is the tragedy of modern masculinity. Men are told to play it safe. But safety is sterile. Safety is boring. And boredom is the enemy of desire. Now let's get even darker. Psychologist John Money, infamous for other reasons, once conducted a controversial series of tests on women's arousal responses. Despite women claiming they were most attracted to kind, emotionally available men, their bodies betrayed them. Their pupils dilated, their heart rates spiked, and their skin flushed when exposed to images of emotionally distant, even dominant men. Like Kinsey, Money suppressed this data because it didn't fit the narrative. A narrative built to tame men, to reshape them into soft creatures who cause no harm, but also spark no hunger. And as a result, men like Edward keep emerging. Smart, successful, deeply confused, and utterly alone. But Freud's insight wasn't an attack on women. It was a mirror. His argument was never, women are manipulative. It was, desire is complicated. Women aren't puppeteers. They're subject to the same evolutionary pressures as men. Only society has permitted them to lie about it. Men who understand this truth don't become manipulators. They become grounded, centered, unshakable. And that energy, what Freud called the masculine frame, isn't toxic, it's attractive. But this is just the beginning. Let's pick up where we left off, with Freud's eerie warning about what happens when society teaches men to suppress their nature in favor of being good. Because we're living through the fallout right now. Millions of men feel invisible, unwanted, lost in a culture that praises sensitivity but rewards dominance. It's not just confusion, it's psychological disarmament. And the worst part, it's not by accident. Let me tell you about Wilhelm Reich. You probably haven't heard of him, but he was one of Freud's most radical students. In 1927, Reich did something almost no psychologist would dare to do today. He interviewed dozens of working-class women, not about love, not about relationships, but about desire. Raw, unfiltered desire. What he discovered was so shocking that his notes were later seized and burned, first by the Nazis, then by the American government. Why? Because Reich revealed that most women weren't craving equality. They were craving polarity. In other words, they wanted men who were their opposites. Stronger, more dominant, more decisive. One woman's words haunted him for years. She said, I don't want to be his friend. I want to be his exception. Let that sink in. Not his equal. His exception. The one woman who could pierce the armor of a powerful man. Not the man who bent over backward to be liked. This isn't some fringe case. It's the same dynamic you see in the rise of dark romance novels, in the explosion of interest in dominant-submissive dynamics, in the kinds of characters women are obsessed with on screen, anti-heroes, criminals, morally complex bad boys. What looks irrational from the outside is completely rational from within the unconscious. And that's Freud's entire point. Female desire doesn't care about social contracts. It runs on the law of emotional gravity. Now let's bring it into the present day. A 2020 study from the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that women reported higher satisfaction and more intense attraction toward partners who displayed assertiveness, even a hint of aggression, not because they wanted to be hurt, but because passion requires friction, and friction requires two different poles. A current can't exist between two identical charges. So what's happening to modern relationships? They're collapsing under the weight of fake equality. Not legal equality, that's crucial, but psychological symmetry. Because when both partners try to be endlessly agreeable, communicative, and emotionally soft, desire dries up. What replaces it is friendship, stability, roommate energy. And here's where the contradiction gets vicious. Society tells men to be open, vulnerable, emotionally expressive, and then shames them when women lose attraction as a result. I want you to imagine a man named Michael. Michael is a 32-year-old engineer, smart, empathetic, a feminist. He listens well, cooks for his girlfriend, remembers anniversaries, and supports her career without ever competing. He's exactly what he thought women wanted, and she leaves him. Why? Because, in her words, I love you, but I'm not in love with you. That phrase should be familiar to most men, and it cuts because it sounds reasonable, even mature. But what it means is, you no longer excite me. Freud saw this coming. He called it the hedonic treadmill, the idea that humans adapt quickly to comfort and start craving challenge. When you give someone everything they say they want, they lose appreciation for it. Desire doesn't live in having, it lives in pursuit. Now this isn't about tricking women. This is about understanding the mechanics of polarity, about stepping back into a frame of being that evokes desire, not pity. So, how do you fix this? Let's look at the science. In the 1970s, anthropologist David Buss ran one of the largest global studies on mate retention. His most controversial discovery: women were most attracted to men who were desired by other women. Inversely, they were least attracted to men who made themselves too available. This wasn't just a cultural quirk. It held across every society they tested, from tribal communities in Africa to modern industrialized cities. Why? Because in evolutionary terms, availability equals weakness, and weakness equals danger. Our ancestors didn't swipe on apps. They judged based on survival cues. A man who was alone, eager, and had no options, he was a risk. A man who was chosen, confident, and in control, he was a resource. Even if only subconsciously, that wiring still dominates attraction today. Freud called this the scarcity principle. Attention only matters when it's earned. Praise is only valued when it comes from someone who doesn't give it easily. So no, the answer isn't manipulation. It's frame control. Let's talk tactics. First of all is the silence strategy. When a woman tests you, and she will, the worst thing you can do is start justifying, explaining, or chasing her approval. Freud noticed in his female patients that silence triggered emotional escalation. Women filled it with imagination. The more a man explained, the less arousing he became. The less he explained, the more they chased the missing meaning. Think about that. The absence of an answer creates tension. And tension, not comfort, is where desire lives. Next is the decisive imperative. In 2022, researchers published a study in social psychological and personality science, showing that women were significantly more attracted to men who made plans without asking for constant feedback. Not because they were authoritarian, but because decision-making is a form of dominance. And dominance, when grounded, not aggressive, is erotic. Finally, there is the reward-punishment loop. This one's controversial, but powerful. It's not manipulation, it's conditioning. When a woman acts in alignment with your values, reward her with presence, affection, and attention. When she disrespects your standards, withdraw, not to hurt her, but to reinforce what is and isn't acceptable in your world. Freud saw this again and again in his case studies. Women didn't respect the men who offered unconditional affection. They respected the ones who valued themselves enough to walk away. And this brings us to Freud's most dangerous idea that female desire is not centered around women at all. It's centered around you. The moment you make her the sun you revolve around, you've already lost. Because true polarity isn't about putting a woman on a pedestal. It's about being the immovable mountain that she orbits. This is what Freud meant by masculine presence. Not loud, not controlling, but anchored. The man who doesn't get pulled by every emotion, who doesn't fumble when tested, who radiates certainty. And here's the kicker. When you step into that energy, not as an act, but as a reality, you stop trying to make her want you. She feels it, and she follows. Because it's not your words that matter. It's the silence you carry. It's not your status. It's the tension you create. It's not your comfort. It's your choice. That's the game. Let's now unlock the most guarded room in Freud's psychological labyrinth. Not about seduction, not about power, but about the subconscious force that turns attraction into obsession. A force so primal, it rewires a woman's nervous system before she's even aware of it. This part is not about tactics, it's about essence. And Freud believed this essence wasn't found in conversation. It was found in contradiction. We begin with one of the most unsettling experiments in sexual psychology, rarely mentioned today. In the 1950s, psychologists noticed a strange trend: women in therapy, even those who came in for trauma, would often form intense emotional attachments to their male analysts. Not because these men were warm or romantic. Quite the opposite. They were reserved, detached, unyielding. Freud called this phenomenon transference, a redirection of subconscious longing toward a symbol of emotional authority. But it went deeper. Women didn't just project emotions onto these men. Their bodies reacted, pulse quickening, voice softening, gaze dilating. This wasn't affection. It was the gravitational pull of psychological asymmetry. Why does this matter? Because it reveals the hidden architecture of female desire. It doesn't flow toward comfort. It flows toward stability under pressure. A man who can hold emotional intensity without flinching becomes not just attractive, but addictive. Now let's fast forward to a chilling observation Freud made in his later years: that the female psyche does not crave balance. It craves emotional disruption. A disruption that doesn't lead to chaos, but to surrender. He termed this the thanatos drive, the subconscious pull not toward pleasure, but toward psychological dissolution. In myth, it's the story of Persephone, drawn into the underworld against her will, only to find her transformation there. In modern terms, it's the woman who falls for the man who unsettles her, because through that unrest, she feels. That feeling, it's not always happiness. It's intensity. And here lies Freud's forbidden thesis: women don't fall for men who make them feel good. They fall for men who make them feel alive. This is the force behind every woman who becomes obsessed with a man she can't understand, who ghosted her, who wasn't consistent, but who left a trail of mystery in his absence. Her mind hates it. Her body can't stop returning to it. The paradox: the men who trigger this effect aren't always good communicators. They're not always kind. But they embody something rare: emotional sovereignty. A man who isn't trying to win her, because he's already won himself. Let's look at the deeper mechanics. In neuroscience, there's a concept called intermittent reinforcement. It's the most addictive behavioral pattern known. It's how casinos hook gamblers, not by giving them constant wins, but by giving them unpredictable, emotional spikes of reward. And studies now confirm this exact pattern is what many women unconsciously associate with attraction. When attention is always available, it becomes background noise. But when it's withdrawn and returned at random, when presence becomes a scarce resource, the mind becomes fixated, not because it's toxic, but because it mirrors the internal chaos of the anima, the feminine force that thrives in emotional contrast. Freud's genius was not in demonizing this process. It was in recognizing its inevitability. And that brings us to one of his final, censored discoveries, what he called libidinal inversion. He noticed that women often became most attracted to the men who resisted them, not just sexually but emotionally. A woman might pursue a man more aggressively after he rejects her, not because of ego, but because his resistance activates her unconscious competition for psychological dominance. We see this everywhere today, from high school crushes to corporate romances, from women doubling down on emotionally unavailable men to pop culture's obsession with the cold, brooding anti-hero. Think of every emotionally volatile woman who swears she hates a man, while still checking his social media, talking about him to friends, secretly hoping he returns. That obsession isn't about him. It's about the emotional pattern he imprinted. So what does this mean for men trying to build real, lasting attraction in a world that tells them to be soft, emotionally open, and endlessly accessible? Here's the key: women don't want chaos, but they are wired to respond to men who can create emotional depth. That doesn't mean playing games. It means becoming the game, a man whose thoughts, movements, and silence provoke reaction not by force, but by presence. Let's crystallize this into 3 deeper principles. 1. Psychological gravity. The most attractive men don't pull women with charm. They hold them with gravity. That means he doesn't explain his decisions, doesn't over-apologize, and doesn't dilute himself to avoid conflict. He speaks when needed. He acts with clarity. He is the fixed point in an emotional storm. When a woman says, "There's just something about him," this is often what she's describing. Not physical features, but energetic posture. Freud wrote in his notes, "The most dangerous men to women are not those who love easily, but those who carry silence as a weapon." Surrender triggers. Surrender in this context is not submission in the degrading sense. It's the softening of emotional defenses. It happens when a woman feels emotionally contained, not dominated, but held. This trigger activates when she feels a man won't be swayed by her storms, that he won't react impulsively to her emotional tests, that his world won't collapse just because she's upset. In relationships, this looks like staying calm when she escalates. It looks like leading with direction, not consultation. It looks like setting boundaries without needing approval. 3. The frame of absence. Here's what no one tells you: a woman thinks more about a man after he disappears than when he's constantly present. Why? Because absence creates internal movement. When you leave a vacuum in her emotional space, her psyche begins to fill it with thoughts, fantasies, projections. Freud didn't just recommend distance. He weaponized it. He observed that women often became more eroticized after therapeutic separation from their male therapists. Because of the lack of closure, longing was generated. In practice, this doesn't mean ghosting. It means strategic non-availability. You're not always on call. You don't drop everything for her. You maintain orbit, but you never collapse your world into hers. Now, let's close with the ultimate reversal. Freud came to believe that female desire, when fully understood, is not about what women consciously want. It's about what their unconscious recognizes as masculine. This doesn't mean you become a tyrant. It means you stop apologizing for polarity. You stop explaining your nature. You live it. Because when you become unapologetically grounded, when you lead without seeking permission, when you walk away from disrespect without drama, when you offer your presence like oxygen and your absence like fire, she feels it in her bones. And that feeling, it's what she's been chasing her entire life, often without knowing why. You were never meant to be her therapist, her savior, her best friend. You were meant to be her anchor. And once you become that, you no longer need tactics. You are the trigger. So ask yourself, am I offering comfort or creating craving? Am I managing her emotions or leading her through them? Am I chasing her approval or living in such truth that her approval becomes irrelevant? Freud's band theory was never about control. It was about contrast. Because in a world that asks men to be softer, safer, smaller, the most dangerous thing you can do is be a mountain. And when she finally finds you, she won't understand why, but she will never forget how you made her feel.